So we are so honored to have a special guest today with us, Dr. Lennox. And Dr. Lennox, could you maybe start by briefly introducing yourself and also tell us a little bit about your book, Can Science Explain Everything? And just quickly describe what is the book about, who is it for, and why should someone read it?
Well, thank you very much. I am delighted to be once again in Slovenia, even though it's on the internet and YouTube. And thank you all for coming this evening. And I'm really delighted to see this book in Slovenian. I can nearly understand just a little of it. But I wrote this book really because many people over the years have asked me to write something on science and Christianity that's accessible to a wide range of people. Many years ago, I wrote a book called God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? And some people found that a little too technical. So I wrote this book to introduce people to the heart of the debate and to correct the false impression that science and God conflict with one another. Basically, one of the important things, and we can talk about it in detail later, is I want to point out that I'm passionate about science. Science is wonderful, but part of its power is that it's restricted in the kind of questions that it can answer. Science cannot answer every question, and I can come back to that in a moment. We need to look wider than science. Unfortunately, many people think that science and rationality are the same thing, so that if you leave the natural sciences, then you leave rationality. Now, that's nonsense, of course, because take a typical university and you'll find that many of the disciplines like history, economics, and languages, literature, these are all rational disciplines, but they're not the natural sciences. So no one who sets up a university believes that natural science can answer every question. And in addition to that, I wanted to point out that you can approach Christianity in a rational way in terms of both history and experience. So that's broadly the sweep of the book. And I've been very encouraged. It's now in many languages and people seem to be able to understand it. So I'm glad you've been able to understand it. So you can now ask me specific questions about it.
You can just quickly tell us or define exactly what is science and what do we mean by faith?
Okay, well, that's two questions, so we'll try, and they're very different questions, although they're related. The question, what is science, is in fact almost impossible to answer. Philosophers of science used to think they could answer it, but now people are much more careful, and they say, well, science is a set of disciplines that deals with analyzing the natural world in various different ways. And there are fundamental ideas associated with science, such as experiment, such as making a hypothesis to explain an experiment, then testing that hypothesis with further experimentation, and so arriving at a possible theory to explain the results of your experimentation. And all those ideas are associated with scientific activity, but there's no one agreed definition that scientists will agree about. But that's okay. St. Augustine once said, we all know what time is until we try to define it. I think that's true of science. We all know what it is until we try to define it. Now, faith has two meanings. The first meaning is religion, the Christian faith. the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, the Hindu faith. That is a set of things to be believed. Its second meaning, though, is simply believing something, my faith. For example, someone might have faith that Manchester United will win the World Cup. And that kind of faith we use every day. It simply means that we believe in something. In English, the word faith comes from the Latin word fides, from which we get fidelity. In other words, things we can trust. And the important thing about faith is, and we all believe many, many things. For instance, you're watching me this evening because you had faith that I would be coming to speak to you. Why did you believe that? Well, you had evidence. What kind of evidence? Well, you may have trusted a friend. You trusted someone, and you had faith enough to turn up and switch on at 8 o'clock. So faith is an everyday activity. And one of the very, very big problems in this area is there is a group of people, atheist scientists, many of them, who have tried to tell people that faith is a religious word only, and that it means believing where there's no evidence. So they come across someone like me and they say, well, Lennox is a man of faith. That means he believes where there's no evidence, so he's not worth talking to. That's sheer nonsense. Believing where there's no evidence is blind faith, and it is very dangerous. But most of us, if we're not crazy or credulous, we believe things and we believe people because we have reason to do that. A child will know who to trust and who not to trust. And the most important thing here is that faith is essential, not only in Christianity, but in science. Science is faith-based. Now, this may surprise many of you, but you see, I am a scientist. I love science, and I would not do it if I did not believe that it could be done. You have to have faith that science could be done in order to do it. Now, more specifically, in order to do science, you must believe that the universe, that the world is accessible, at least in part, by the human mind. And Einstein, the famous Nobel Prize winning Albert Einstein, regarded this faith in the intelligibility of the universe as absolutely fundamental to science. He once said, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith that the universe is intelligible to the human mind. And here's a very important thing. When people use the word faith, you always must ask the question, faith in what? So you asked me to talk to you about science. I've done that a little bit, and faith. I didn't say to you, faith in what? I presume you meant faith in God. But actually, what I've done is to try to show you that faith in science is very important indeed. And so the basic issue is, what is the evidence on which faith in God can be based? And for me as a scientist, my approach to Christianity is exactly the same as it is to science. What is the evidence?
Thank you, Dr. Lennox. Moving on, a bit similar question could be, and I'm sure you get this a lot, and the question would be, how can one be both a scientist and a Christian? How is that possible?
Very easily, actually, because there's a long historical tradition here that many people just do not know. If you go back to the foundations or the start of modern science in the 16th and the 17th centuries, you would think of people like Galileo, Kepler, Isaac Newton, and then coming up through history, there'd be Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, and so on. All of these people believed in God. Now, that has been noticed for many years, that we owe to believers in God the foundations of contemporary science. Now, philosophers and historians have asked the question, is there a connection between the rise of modern science and faith in God? And the answer is there's a very clear connection. Newton, for example, believed science could be done because he saw the universe as the handiwork of a creator God. Similarly with Kepler, similarly with Faraday, similarly with Clerk Maxwell. And there's a wonderful summary of this by C.S. Lewis, who wrote, "Men became scientific." I'm afraid there were no women scientists in those days. There are many very good ones now, but there weren't then. So please forgive me for quoting Lewis exactly. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, faith in God was not a hindrance to their science. It was the motor that drove it. So I'm not embarrassed to be both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was Christianity that gave me the science that I study. There's a very close link. You see, the interesting thing is that science and faith in God fit together beautifully historically. But science and atheism, to my mind, do not fit at all. And we can come to that if you want to ask me about it later.
Thank you once again. Moving on to the next question. And let's suppose we say that God does exist, and then an answer might come, a question might come. Someone might ask, well, okay, God exists, but who created God?
Well, they might indeed, and they do. And actually, it's it's a very interesting question to analyze from a logical perspective, because Richard Dawkins, for example, in his very famous book, The God Delusion, uses that argument really to say that God cannot exist, because if God created the universe, you'd have to ask who created God, and then you'd have to ask who created the God that created the God that, and you go on back forever. But this is not straight thinking. So let's analyze it logically, if it's not too late at night for logic for you. If you ask the question, who or what created X? Then what are you assuming about X? The question assumes that X was created. So if you ask who or what created God, you're talking about a created God. You're talking about an idol. You're not talking about the God of the Bible, who claims to be eternal and therefore not created. So the interesting thing is, the question who created God does not apply to the only God that is worth taking seriously. That is the eternal God of the Bible. Now, Dawkins doesn't appear to be able to believe in the eternal, although sometimes I wonder what he really believes about the universe. Now, when he faced me with that question, and you can see him doing that in one of our debates on YouTube on my website, which, by the way, is johnlennox.org, I said to him what I've just said to you, but then I said something else. I said, the question is only valid for created things. So let me apply it to you. You believe that the universe created you, which he does, Dawkins. So I said, who created your creator then? Well, I've still been waiting for that answer for about 14 years, and there's no answer. You see, philosophically, this is a silly question, really, although it sounds very convincing. What you're really asking is, do the questions go back forever or do they stop? Now, I find for a Christian, they stop with God. And because God is uncreated and eternal, the question, who created God, is meaningless. But for most of my atheist friends, the questions stop with the universe or the multiverse, or these days, nothing. In other words, nothing created everything is a common view among cosmologists. So the questions stop there. And so, therefore, what you have to decide is which side makes most sense. And for me, the obvious answer is the Christian side makes complete sense, whereas the atheist side makes no sense at all.
Again, similar to the question I've asked. Again, the same question was posed by Richard Dawkins, and the belief in God is some sort of a delusion. And I'm interested. What would you reply?
Well, that is a claim about the human mind and psychiatry, and I suppose it goes back essentially to Sigmund Freud, who wrote about God being an illusion or a delusion. And it's a claim about a psychological state of the human mind. Now, when I first read that, I thought this is interesting because Richard Dawkins is not a psychologist. I also am not a psychologist. So, what do you do when you get a claim about psychology written by a non psychologist? Well, what I do is to check with psychologists. And a very famous psychologist in England, Andrew Sims, was president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And he wrote a book that completely trashes, rubbishes Dawkins' view. And indeed, a number of atheists wrote and said Dawkins doesn't know what he's talking about. In fact, as far as psychiatry goes, there's very strong evidence, and Sims quotes it in his book, and I mention it in my little book, that belief in God is associated with very positive things in human experience, sense of well-being, of meaning in life, of less drug addiction, of much more stable relationships, and so on. And if you were going on the basis of evidence, you would say that psychiatry provided a very good base for believing in God. But the point I'm going to make is that Dawkins' argument that God is an illusion only works if God does not exist. Stating God is a delusion doesn't prove God doesn't exist. That's simply a statement of his belief. And there's a brilliant German psychiatrist called Manfred Lutz, and he has written about this. And he says, well, if God does not exist, then Freud's argument works very well to show you that religion is a delusion if God does not exist. But if God does exist, then the very same argument shows you that atheism is a delusion. The desire not to have anything to do with God. And there's a very famous Polish Nobel Prize winner for literature called Czesław Miłosz. And he said atheism is the great opium of the people. And he simply reversed Freud's argument. So my conclusion, I agree with Lutz entirely. If God doesn't exist, then religion's a delusion. If God does exist, atheism is a delusion. But Freud or any other psychiatrist cannot answer the basic question that's hiding here. Does God exist or not? You have to look elsewhere for evidence. But some of it, oddly enough, is actually in the discipline of psychiatry.
Thank you very much. And now, my last question would be, in your book, you mentioned this incident where you were sat down by this Nobel Prize winner and another two scientists, and you were sort of pressured into giving up your faith. And now my question would be, what would your advice be like to some young Christian students who is being pressured or something like that?
Well, that happened when I was 19, so it's a very long time ago. It's 59 years ago yesterday, more or less, because my birthday was yesterday, and it made a deep impression on me. Here was a man that said that I would not become a good mathematician or scientist if I stayed believing in God, so I should give it up. And I should do that in front of witnesses. And I said to him, "What have you got to offer me that's better than what I've got?" And what he offered me was a hopeless philosophy that I knew something about. So I said to him, "If that's all you can offer me, well, I'll stick with what I've got." I got up and left. But that was a very important event for me because it showed me that there's a dark side of academia, that some leading scientists would try to go outside their realm and to try to force people. And what I would say to young Christians is firstly this: not every statement by a scientist is a statement of science. That's a hugely important thing, because if Richard Dawkins says God is a delusion, that's not a statement of science. It's a statement by a scientist, but it's actually a statement of his own personal belief. And it's, in my estimation, it's completely false. So that this Nobel Prize winner, who said that I would never get anywhere if I remained a believer in God, that was his personal belief. But it showed me, although I did not know this at the time, that he was so utterly wrong, even at that level. You know, very few people realize that between 1900 and 2000, that's a whole century, over 65% of all Nobel Prize winners are believers in God. So actually, statistical evidence is that belief in God is more likely to be associated with the Nobel Prize than it is not. Certainly in that century. I know the situation has changed a bit, but there are still Nobel Prize winners alive who do believe in God. So it's very important to respect. I'm speaking now to younger scientists, to respect those who are more experienced, but do learn to distinguish between when they talk about their science, where they may be world authorities, and when they start talking about things in which they're just ordinary people. And you're entitled to your opinion as much as they are of theirs. So you can ask them, what is the evidence on which they base their belief? And that can often reveal some very interesting things. Don't let yourself be browbeaten. But you know, the effect of that incident was that I said to myself, if ever I do make it in science and get a credible position in the university, the one thing I will never do is try to pressurize people into agreeing with me. You see, if he'd been a Christian and I had been an atheist student, and he had tried to pressurize me into Christianity, he probably would have lost his job the next day. It's not a fair world as far as that is concerned. And I fear that many university professors are simply teaching atheism rather than teaching their own subject. So I resolved that what I would do is what I'm doing with you now. And that is, I try to provide evidence on which I base my faith in God and my faith in science. and let you make up your own mind, because that is the most important thing you can do. That's what a university is for, or should be for, to give you evidence from different perspectives. It's a university. It's bringing all kinds of views together so that you can make up your mind without being pressurized. And that's what I am very convinced about, that it's important for me to do.
Thank you, Marco, for your questions. I would like to start my portion of questions with this. Are science and its methods used in the Bible?
Well, let's just refine that question. We use science and its methods to study something, that is the world. The world is presented to us, the universe, the stars, and all of that. So science is a set of disciplines that studies that. So if you say, are scientific methods used in the Bible, we need to be careful. What could we mean by that? Here we have the Bible. That is something to be studied. And your question really means, to me at least, this: can rational science type methods be used to study and understand the Bible? Absolutely, yes, at many different levels. For a start, the Bible is an ancient document. How do we study ancient documents? Well, ancient historians are the experts on ancient documents, and they will actually use natural sciences to come up with dating of these documents and all this kind of thing. So we can use the natural sciences to establish the credibility in certain directions of the ancient biblical documents. But the key thing is that your question hits on. We don't use our brains and our minds and our reason studying the universe, and then we shut them when it comes to the Bible, and we simply close our eyes and say, I believe it. No, because the Bible itself tells us to use our minds. Now, this is hugely important. So let me explain that a little bit more. I said earlier that faith, in order to be valid, must be evidence-based. It must have some grounds. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus makes a number of claims, and they're huge claims. He claims to be God incarnate. And that's a staggering claim. He claims to have come from another world, from heaven, and so on. Now, the Gospels were written to give us evidence for the truth of those claims. How do I know that? Well, here's a famous example of that. In the fourth biography of Jesus, which is the Gospel of John as we know it, John tells us why he wrote the book. And he says, look, Jesus did many other signs that are not written in this book. We normally call these signs miracles, but the word sign is interesting. A sign points to something beyond itself. And Jesus, the special things that he did, pointed towards his identity. So John says, Jesus did many others. They're not in this book. But the ones that he has chosen are in the book. Why? He's written them, so he himself says, that you might believe, have faith, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. In other words, John says, I have selected certain incidents in the life of Jesus, things that he did, and I have selected them carefully so that they will enable you to have a grounded faith. Here are reasons to believe. Now that tells me straight away that the kind of faith in God and Christ that the New Testament expects is evidence-based faith. We're not expected to close our eyes and just take a leap of faith into the dark That is existentialism. That's not Christianity. Christianity is a step into the light based on evidence that is commensurate with the things being claimed. And that is why people like me, who are scientists, but also the early apostles, placed a strong evidence on the resurrection of Jesus, because that is something that we can think about rationally. And indeed, I do that in my little book, as you will see if you read it.
Thank you. The next question is, are miracles real or possible?
Well, that comes after that question. You've hit the right thing to ask. Well, not everything that claims to be a miracle is a miracle. And of course, we often say, well, you know, Vanya, it's a miracle she passed her exam. Now, we're not talking about that kind of thing. The miracles in the New Testament, the signs, as John calls them, are supernatural events. What does that mean? It means that you cannot understand them within the normal cause and effect web that we discover in scientific investigation. And that's where many people say, well, that's the end of that then. Christianity must be false, because those days people didn't understand the laws of nature, and so they could easily see a miracle anywhere. Nowadays, we know the laws of nature, and we know that miracles are not possible, so therefore they don't exist. Now, that is very, very confused thinking. Let me go into it carefully. Firstly, in those days, they knew that people didn't rise from the dead. In fact, when Jesus rose, they recognized it as a miracle because they knew that people didn't rise from the dead. And there's a famous example of this. When Joseph, who was betrothed to Mary, the mother of Jesus, when she told him that she was pregnant, he, so the record goes, wanted to divorce her quietly. Why? Not because he didn't know where babies came from, but because he did. And he just rejected the story, and it took very powerful evidence. God had to send an angel to convince him that something supernatural had happened, and therefore it was okay. So these were not primitive people who had no idea and therefore could believe in a miracle. And Joseph didn't say, oh, you're pregnant, oh, wonderful. That's a miracle. Not at all, you see. Number two, a lot of the difficulty goes back to a philosopher, a Scottish philosopher. And by ancestry, I'm Scottish, so I need to be careful. But his name was David Hume. And he said miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and essentially, therefore, impossible. But Hume was wrong. And that's important to realize he was wrong. I can demonstrate that quite easily, that with an analogy that C.S. Lewis told, which I think is very helpful. Suppose I'm staying in London in a hotel for a few days, and on the first night I put, let's say, I put £50 in my bedside drawer. And the second night I put another 50. So 50 plus 50 is 100. And on the third night, I open the drawer and I find just £10 in the drawer. Now, I put 50 in night one, 50 in night two. The law of arithmetic tells me that there are £200 in the drawer. On day three, I find £10. What do I say? Well, do I think that the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of England? Well, of course, I know the laws of England have been broken. A thief has taken £90. But how do I know the laws of England have been broken? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. You see, and this helps to think of the whole situation. My mistake was to think that the drawer and my room, if you like, were a closed system. of cause and effect so that nobody could get in. But I was wrong. A thief got in. Now, the laws of arithmetic don't say, stop, you can't do this. 50 plus 50 is 100. You cannot take 90. That's nonsense. And the confusion here is simply this, that the laws of nature are not like laws of a country. They're totally different. The laws are simply of nature, are our descriptions of regularities that we observe that have been built into the universe by the Creator. But the laws don't stop God, the Creator, feeding a new event in. Let me give you a simple example. Newton's law tells me that if I drop this, it will fall towards the center of the earth. But Newton's law doesn't say nobody can catch it before it hits the earth. Somebody can come in from the outside and catch it because it's not a closed system. So that shows me straight away that the supernatural miracles are possible. Science cannot stop them. Science usually deals with what regularly happens. It can't stop God feeding a new event in. But as to whether a given miracle happened or not, then that's a question of history. And the main one to talk about there would be the resurrection of Christ, which I do fairly extensively in the book.
Yes, thank you for starting this. My next question is, how can you, a scientist, believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Well, first of all, we need to say that the New Testament claims that Jesus rose from the dead. That's what started Christianity. You think that of Judaism, the early disciples were all Jews. Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. They don't go out to make converts. And yet suddenly, 20 centuries ago, you get an explosion starting in Jerusalem and rapidly going around the Roman Empire of people that say that Jesus is risen. So the very existence and rapid spread of the Christian church is evidence that something happened. Now, what happened? Now, here it gets extremely interesting, and I give some examples in my book. The first people to ask are the ancient historians. And we start slowly. And the first thing is to establish that Jesus existed. Now, some people say he never existed. Well, that is historically false. And ancient historians are essentially all agreed that he existed. Not only that, even atheist ancient historians are agreed about many of the things that the Gospels claimed he did, even to the extent of atheist historians saying that the disciples saw something after his death. Now, they don't think it was a resurrection, but that they had some experience that they called a resurrection, they think is pretty certain. And one of the most interesting things to do is to look at what ancient historians from different perspectives say. And I've recorded some of these in my book just to give you a flavor of the fact that sometimes it's religious people that have massive difficulty about the resurrection, but the historians, who are the real people we should ask, have very little difficulty because they see that the Gospels have shown themselves to be authentic and accurate in so many different details. So that would be my first approach. But secondly, there's the experience approach. There's a historical approach because the resurrection occurred in the past. It's a unique event in the past. But then Jesus made claims, and he said that if I'm prepared to believe that he is actually God become human, who died for me on the cross. Now, this might be difficult for some people to accept, but this is the claim. And I often say, to people, look, please listen to what Christianity says before you reject it. Try to understand it, even though you don't understand it completely. Try to listen to what it says. And what it says is that Jesus claims to have come into the world to be the savior of the world. Do I need saving? I certainly do. I do not even keep my own moral standards, let alone God's. And Christ claimed that he was dying for me. Now, that's a deep mystery, and I don't understand it completely. But then I don't understand energy. I don't know what consciousness is, and nor does any scientist. There's so many things in this world we just do not know, but we know they're there. And Jesus makes these claims, but he says this, that if we're prepared to repent, what does that mean? That means facing the mess I've made of my own life, and sadly, maybe the mess of other people's lives, and acknowledge that there's something wrong with me that needs forgiveness. That if I trust Christ, then he is prepared to forgive me, and he is prepared to give me a new life that will battle against these negative tendencies in my life. He's prepared to give me peace. He's prepared to bring meaning into my life. Now, these are very real things, particularly to young people today. Every student I meet wants meaning in their life, and most of them understand guilt and the need for forgiveness. Christ offers these things. Now, I've lived for a long time. I was, as I said, 78 years old yesterday. And again, I have seen students who are in a mess in their lives. And I meet them 6 months later, and they're completely transformed. They've got peace, they're happy, they're radiating. And I say, what has happened to you? And they may say it in different ways. They may say, well, I became a Christian, or I came to trust Jesus, or I got converted. But whatever way they describe it, it's clear that something real has happened in their lives. And for me, the final evidence that Jesus rose from the dead is that he's still alive, and he can do these things for me and for other people. And therefore, you have evidence from different sides. You have the historical evidence, but then you have the evidence in your own experience.
Thank you, Noel, for your questions. Now we have a few questions from the public, from the audience. Now, the first question is basically in two parts, so I'll just start with the first part. Why do you think God created dinosaurs?
Sorry?
Why do you think God created dinosaurs?
I have no idea. I suppose he thought it was terrific fun. How can one possibly answer a question like that? Why did he create spiders? At any rate, he made the world very interesting. But that's as far as I could go. I just don't know because I have no information.
And the second part is, and do you think they were wiped out with the flood in Genesis, meaning about the story of Noah's Ark?
Well, I'm no expert in this, but the current explanation from cosmologists is they were wiped out by a comet hitting the Earth. But the Earth was certainly, in the flood, a great deal was destroyed. But I just don't know because there's no real evidence to substantiate it. We can speculate, but I'm not prepared to speculate, you see, because what will happen is you'll go away and say, well, Lennox believes X. Well, Lennox doesn't know.
Thank you. The next question is also from the audience, and someone asked, in your experience, do you say that there are more atheists among the natural science academics or among the non-natural science academics?
Probably among the natural scientists, yes. There are more believers. Once you go outside the sciences, you find the number of atheists is much greater. This may have to do with the fact that, well, it's hard to say that in the humanities, the influence of literature and philosophy, particularly at the current time, means that one of the dominant philosophies in the universities, in the academy, is naturalism, which is atheism or materialism even. But interestingly enough, various surveys have been done among natural scientists, and there was one done in 1916 and was repeated in 1996, I think 80 years later. And the percentage of people who believed not only in God, but in a personal God who answers prayer had only moved down by 2% from 40 to 38. Nowadays, I don't know what the recent surveys say. There is certainly a decline, but in the University of Oxford, where I am a professor, it is amazing the number of natural scientists who are believers. Now, there are many people in the humanities who are believers, but my guess would be it's considerably less. But it's very hard to answer the question, why is that the case? Because you have to take each individual person, what each person believes and why they believe it. That's a very complex thing.
We have another question coming up from the audience. How can we know that other recently discovered documents are not divinely inspired? And by that, the member from the audience gave us an example of the Gospel of Thomas. How can we know that it's not divinely?
Well, I think, and again, I'm sitting here in front of a computer, and one would need to check, but having read the Gospel of Thomas some time ago and gone into the evidence, the difference in quality between these documents and the New Testament is absolutely massive. That's the first thing. Secondly, the early church itself did not recognize them as genuine, and that should be an indicator. But you would need to look into this yourself, and this gives me an opportunity to say something very important to you. This is a Q&A, and you can only get my instant reaction, but that doesn't matter, because if you're not satisfied with what I say, and you won't be on many questions, the much more important thing is the work you do after we're finished tonight to get a proper answer to your question. So if you're really interested in the status of the Gospel of Thomas, that will be shown by the amount of work that you do afterwards to find out. And there's a lot of stuff that is written on these things that is readily accessible on the internet.
Thank you. The next question from the audience is, how do you think the quantum mechanics add to the idea of God and science are intertwined? What about the God particle?
Well, Professor Higgs, who discovered the Higgs boson, which is called the God particle, he didn't like that at all. And in fact, where that expression came from is not very certain. And it was a negative comment rather than a positive comment. But the serious question is about quantum mechanics. That opens up a whole area of thought, because what quantum mechanics has done is to remove the deterministic views that were very common as a result of Newton's mechanics. Because Isaac Newton, although a believer in God, and he did some wonderful mathematics that I used to enjoy teaching very much, but it gave people the impression, if they weren't careful, that this is a very mechanical universe operating on fixed laws, and therefore everything is determined. And so there's no such thing as free will. And so love is an illusion, morality is an illusion, and all these kind of things. But what quantum mechanics did was introduce into science itself a degree of uncertainty and indeterminacy. And I've just written a new book which came out 3 weeks ago called Cosmic Chemistry. Do God and Science Mix? And I've got several chapters there on quantum mechanics. because it seems to me it's very important that we realize there's been a revolution in the natural sciences, and that opens up many more possibilities than were there before. We can no longer speak of a deterministic universe, and therefore that kind of avenue for those who would want to deny free will, and there are many people like that. Stephen Hawking did, for example, and Dawkins, so far as I know. So it's a good question to pursue again. And if you want to know what I think about it, then my new book, it's a huge, huge topic.
How would you explain the tremendous amount of death and pain and suffering in the nature, even before the human beings came to exist, even before the fall?
The problem of pain and death and suffering is the hardest problem anybody faces. And I have a lot of sympathy for people that look at this and say, therefore, there is no God. But if you take that view, and I understand it, and I have many atheist friends actually who would say, look, you say you see evidence of design in the universe and in science, I accept that, but don't talk to me about a personal God because of all this pain, suffering, and death and everything else. And what I say to them is that, yes, I understand your objection, but if you remove God, you don't take away the suffering and pain. It's still there. The death is still there. But what you do remove is all hope. And that needs to be thought about. If atheism is true, well, then there is no ultimate hope. People try to make do with lesser hopes, but there's no ultimate hope because death ends everything. Now, as a Christian, I have a huge problem with pain and suffering and death and all the rest of it. But I have hope because I believe that there is historical evidence and experimental evidence that I've just mentioned that Christ has broken the death barrier, that he is raised from the dead. And let me put it this way, and this is quite important, Marco. There are no simplistic answers here. You see, when we look at suffering and pain and death, there are two perspectives. If you're just observing suffering, that's one perspective. But if you're actually suffering yourself, that's another perspective. And it's actually the reason I wrote a book, which I believe is in Slovenian already, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? To try to help people to think through these issues. And because this is a huge topic, we can only at the moment say something brief about it, but I would strongly recommend that book if you can tell the audience tonight where to get it, because it doesn't have all the answers, of course not, nor do I, but it gives us a window, an opening, a possibility. And the God I believe in is a God who has suffered. At the heart of Christianity is a cross. And if that is God involved there, then it tells me, at the very least, that God has not remained distant from our human suffering, but has become part of it. And that's where I begin to have hope. Doesn't mean I solve all the problems. It doesn't mean I have no pain. It doesn't mean I won't die of COVID-19 or in a car accident. But it does mean that if I do die in some way like that, I have real hope, because through trusting Christ, I know that I will one day be raised by his power from the dead. So that's a very short and inadequate response to that.
Thank you so much. And for our final question of the evening, again from the audience, is why is the Bible authoritative? Why not other holy books? And with it, why not other religions?
Well, this is a hugely important issue, of course. And when we look at the Bible and other holy books, as you say, in other religions, how are we going to decide about them? Now, I don't count myself an expert in all religions, although I've read many of the holy books, simply to find out what my friends and fellow human beings believe. But we've been talking about science and rational thought, and we must apply it here, because it must be obvious to everybody that the different religions of the world disagree. Leave Christianity aside for the moment, because that's what I believe. Compare, for instance, Islam and Hinduism. My Muslim friends believe in only one God. Hindu religion believes in many, many hundreds, if not thousands of gods, and they will never agree about that. And they agree about that view as well. Now, how do you get into this without creating a lot of trouble and difficulty and hatred and this kind of thing? Well, here's one way, I think. When we come to discuss other religions, it's hugely important to realize that all around the world, in people of all religions or none, there is a set of common human values. And it's absolutely remarkable to find that. For example, Christians call the golden rule, the principle, do to others what you want them to do to you. You will find that in Judaism, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Buddhism. You'll find it in Roman pagan religion. You'll find it in non-religious humanism. You'll find it in every single religion and philosophy in the world. Now, that's a very interesting phenomenon. We have basic human convictions that are parallel. Now, there are differences, of course, in morality around the world, but the fact that there is this common core of values means that civilization doesn't completely collapse. It's possible. And from where I sit, that is evidence that human beings are hardwired to be moral beings. That is the way God has created them from a Christian perspective. Now, what I find is this, that when I see another human being, what do I believe about her or about him? I believe they are of infinite value, made in the image of God, and that they're moral beings. That's the first thing. And I want them to know that I believe that about them. Because if you don't communicate that kind of respect, you see, I was taught this by my parents, as I explained in my little book. In a divided country where there was terrorism, in my home country, Northern Ireland, where there were two factions of Christianity fighting each other, and it had very little to do with real Christianity. My father employed people from both sides because he believed that every man and woman was made in the image of God, quite irrespective of what they believed. And I've tried to practice that. Now, if we agree on that, then and only then can we discuss the differences. And everybody has to make up their own mind. Let me give you two quick examples. The first is the center point of Christianity, as I've said, is the resurrection of Jesus. Now, my Jewish friends believe that Jesus died, but did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he did not die. I believe he both died and rose. Those three things cannot simultaneously be true from a historical perspective. And so you've got to decide on the test of history which one you believe. That's the first thing. Secondly, religion has to do with morality, of course, as I've explained. But the main differences between different religions do not occur so much at the level of moral teaching, although they may occur there. They occur at the level of the basis for a relationship with God. Now, I've asked many people from different parts of the world what they think a religion is. And they often say a religion is very like a university course. You have an entrance to get into the university, you have some sort of ceremony and you get in, and then you have a path that you follow. And you have guidance and teaching from professors. And then at the end, there's a big examination. And no matter how much those professors like you, they cannot guarantee that you get a degree. Why? Because a degree depends on your merit. And everybody understands that. And many people think that religion is like that you have some sort of ceremony at the beginning, perhaps even when you're a child. And then you are on the path or the way or whatever it calls itself. And you various people who teach you, gurus, priests, imams, teachers, all sorts of people. But in the end, you will come to an assessment, to a judgment. And all those teachers cannot guarantee that God will receive you at the end because it depends on your merit. And if your good deeds are way more than your evil deeds, then you may be accepted at the end. But you will only know that at the end because it's a merit-based system. Now, this is where the major difference is. Christianity is not a religion in that sense whatsoever. And that comes as a shock to many people, because in Christianity, God's acceptance occurs not at the end, but at the beginning. And this is what's utterly revolutionary about it. Now, this doesn't prove it's true, but let me say what I said earlier. We need to listen to what Christianity says before we reject it. And here's the marvelous thing, to my mind, that I come to God through Christ, and he tells me, look, you can never earn my acceptance because you are a flawed person. Sin has damaged you in the biblical terminology. You've come short. But I'm prepared to accept you not because of your merit, but because of what Christ has done. And if you trust him, then his death will be counted as your salvation. Now, this is absolutely magnificent. It means, you see, that I'm accepted at the beginning of the journey, and I've known that for over 70 years. You see, I don't do talks like this in interviews in the hope that God will accept me one day. I do them because I know God has accepted me, and I love to serve him in that way. Now, this is utterly unique. And what is very interesting is that the merit system we do not normally use when it comes to relationships. I sometimes tell a silly story. I've been married for 53 years to the same person. And I say, I saw a very nice girl at Cambridge, and I decided I'd like to marry her. So I gave her a present of a cookery book. And I said, now have a look at the laws for making apple cake. I like apple cake, Apfelstrudel. And here are the laws. You shall take so much sugar. You shall take so much flour. You shall mix them together. You shall put them in the oven. You shall cook them for so many degrees centigrade for so long, and so on. Now I say, it's going to be like this. If you will do this for the next, let's say, 30 or 40 years, then I will accept you. If not, you'll go back to your mother. Now, of course, any girl with any sense would throw the book in my face and think of murdering me, possibly. And we laugh at that story. It is just so absurd. My marriage relationship is not based on my wife's success at cooking over the past 50 years, although she's a very good cook. It's based on the fact that at the beginning she accepted me and I accepted her unconditionally. We would never insult a fellow human being by treating them like that, by saying, I will accept you if you do this and this. And yet millions of people around the world think of God like that. If I do this and I do that and I try to keep your laws, will you accept me? Well, it is impossible. And that's one of the main reasons I am a Christian, because this makes sense to me. It's to do with a relationship with God, not just with trying to keep a lot of laws at all. So that's the beginning of the way I would approach that question.
Thank you very much for all the answers. Thank you again.
My pleasure, and thank you for the good questions and the audience.